Welcome to presentation 35. Looking at the Gospel of Matthew, the story of Jesus as recorded by Matthew. In the last presentation we looked at how injustice ruled. Jesus now was in the Garden of Gethsemane, an evening location where he and his friends would gather. Judas would know that, and he brought the leaders there, the Jewish leaders, to arrest him. He'd been preparing himself for what lay ahead. Now he was arrested, and there was an overnight trial. His friends desert him, and Peter lets him down. And then he's brought before Pilate, the Roman governor, who alone had the power to authorize execution. And all the conflicts of the Jewish leadership were presented before Pilate. In all of this, Jesus never defends himself, never protests his innocence. He's condemned to death by torture. Total injustice. But he went all through this by choice. We have a picture here of Jesus in total control of events. Injustice, but he didn't fight it. And when Peter tries to protect Jesus at the beginning of the arrest, these words of Jesus, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." The great principle, retaliatory violence, is incompatible with the way of Jesus. And we, the followers of Jesus, must always be utterly rejecting any retaliatory violence ever. So often in our world today, violence, deception and coercion seem to win, and they often do win, but in the long run it merely destroys those who perpetrate them. Because Jesus demonstrates the correct way. Rejecting violence and coercion, seeking the best for the other, always wins. And Jesus showed that. Jesus accepts descriptions of himself, but we have to understand these as they would be understood by Jesus, which reflects the way the Old Testament saw them. Son of God means that all the nature of God and his authority rested on Jesus. God entered our humanity by choice, limited within a human being. That's taken from the book of Daniel. Though it can mean simply a human being, it's a picture of a remarkable human being who is presented to God, taken into God's presence and given all authority. That's the exaltation of Jesus, his work completed. Messiah simply means the sent one of God, and Isaiah pictures that as the suffering servant. Who was responsible for the death of Jesus? Jesus handed him over. Whatever his motives may have been, he tries to escape responsibility and comes to a sticky end. The religious leaders, they tried to pass the blame back onto Jesus. He was a blasphemer. He claimed to be God. That's because he was God. They are responsible. Pilate knew he wasn't guilty. He tried to escape responsibility, but he was fearful. So he transfers responsibility to the renter mob that were around the Jewish leadership. And they accept that responsibility, but were probably unaware of what they were doing. They were consigning their nation and their religious system to oblivion, and that happened in AD 70 when the Romans wiped it out. Motives behind the scene? Pilate just wanted some way off the hook. He knew what was happening. He wasn't a fool. But he also knew that his reputation wasn't that strong, and he had to make sure there wasn't a street riot. They just wanted Jesus out the way. They wanted to run their religious system which kept them in power and in control. And the crowd, followers of the religious leaders, not the crowd that welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem. And they were anti-Jesus. They wanted to retain the religious establishment. But Jesus himself, he faced this combination of religion and politics against him. Always the most powerful condemnation, bringing devastation and destruction. He didn't fight it, he took it on. And in so doing, he broke the power of satanic control on humanity. He broke the power of evil. He exposed it for what it was. Suffering love always wins. And he offers freedom and hope for humanity, if only we'll accept it. Now let's move on. That was injustice, now it's enacted. The thing is carried out. Let's look at the approximate timeline. Putting together all the evidence, and we've got to be careful in interpreting the gospel stories because time was counted differently and there were at least 2 different systems. And indeed, an hour is 60 minutes in our timing, but that wasn't even true at that time. They didn't have timepieces like we did, and they didn't have calendars. On the Thursday, the Passover meal, gathering in the Gethsemane garden, handed over by Judas, who knew where Jesus and his friends were. An overnight illegal trial, and that took it into the early hours of Friday morning. And on Friday, at dawn taken before Pilate, the brutal flogging, 2 soldiers carried it out, the mocking, the crucifixion. Death was checked, and we'll see why in a moment. And then burial followed, which was unusual. So that's the approximate timeline, bringing together the accounts of the various Gospels and allowing for the systems of time, the different systems that were in use. Gives us a picture of the terrible events. Now we have 4 accounts in the 4 Gospels in our New Testament. We need to remember that these are the only Gospel accounts that were written in the 1st century. They are eyewitness accounts. There are other Gospels in existence, but none dates earlier than the late 2nd century. We discount them for the moment. These are the 4 eyewitness accounts written by followers of Jesus. Now they record important details. They don't all record the same details because the different writers remember different things that were important, but they give us an overall picture. Nothing much is made of the actual crucifixion, the torture, the agony. That's not emphasized. It's simply recorded as facts. And the facts are remarkably consistent, but written by 4 people, using 4 different sources of information from eyewitnesses. If we look at the New Testament as a whole, the crucifixion has a central place. And it still has a central place with the followers of Jesus today. And the strange irony is that the cross is an instrument of torture. Brutal, horrendous torture. and yet it holds a central place in the lives of the followers of Jesus. Those who are experts in this describe it as the most barbaric and humiliating form of torture that humanity has ever invented. And we've invented some pretty horrendous things over the centuries. The Romans didn't invent it, they picked it up, and they found it was a powerful weapon to terrorize conquered peoples. Do what we say and do it in the way we demand, otherwise this is what's going to happen to you. It could only be applied to men. And people watched it, forced to watch it, to watch a loved one dying in the most terrible agony, publicly humiliated. We can see here that this barbaric form of violence and brutality, it goes back to Jesus rejecting violence. He allowed himself to be destroyed by that most horrendous violence. And in the process, he robbed violence of its power. He won through. He conquered it. He exposed it. Violence never wins. Suffering love always does. He didn't complain. He didn't criticize. He didn't condemn. He just went through it. Hour after hour of agony and torture. Suffering love always wins in the long run. And it's something that our world today needs to understand. We think we can win battles with violence. We can bomb people into submission. We can force people to do what we want them to do. It's the way of dictatorial leadership all over the world. In the long run, history shows it never wins. The way of Jesus always wins. Now there's a description of what it means. It's deliberately slow, incredibly painful. There are variations on it, but the condemned person is tied or nailed to a large wooden cross, some form of wood, and just left to hang till they're dead. Could take hours, could take days. Every breath agony. It appears to have been invented in the 6th century BC. There are no records anywhere that existed before that. It was probably invented in the area of the Assyrians. Historically, the Assyrians were a brutal people. Alexander the Great, in his great but short campaigns, conquered that area and discovered this method of death by torture, brought it back into the Roman Empire. And the Romans then used it, till eventually it was abolished. Abolished because it was simply too awful. The way of suffering love won through in the end. Tragically, it has been used more recently. It was used in Japan against Japanese people who'd become Christians, followers of Jesus, to humiliate and torture them and frighten the population. Don't you ever dare to follow the way of Jesus. But it's also been used in several countries in more modern years, and there are recorded cases in Burma, Iran, Saudi Arabia and Sudan, used against followers of Jesus by either Buddhist or Muslim peoples to terrorize others that no one should ever dare to leave their religion and follow the way of Jesus. This is how it was carried out. It was a standard procedure. There would be a Roman officer and 4 soldiers. The victim was nailed or tied onto a bar of wood. Then this bar, the soldiers using their strength, would be lifted onto a vertical support, so the person would be hanging by their arms, often dislocating the shoulders in the process. Agony. Feet were nailed on, and the soldiers were not allowed to leave until death had taken place. They worked in shifts, because it could take hours or a day or 2. The soldier was never left unguarded through all the torture they went through. These Roman soldiers were hardened off to this. And if anything went wrong, the soldiers themselves were promptly executed under Roman law. These Roman soldiers and their officer did not make a mistake because their lives were on the line. Now, a fit young man could last for a day or 2. But Jesus had been flogged, and a flogging could kill a man. It was so violent. The flesh of his back had been ripped off, and he'd be bleeding extensively. The blood loss would weaken him. And in the sun, the dehydration would be horrendous. If the legs of the victim were broken, they could no longer breathe, because the lungs will not operate unless you press down on the legs, which of course were nailed on. In the case of Jesus, there was a check made that he had died, and a Roman javelin was thrust up under his ribcage into his heart cavity. John describes it in his account. Jesus was dead. This confirmed it. Death usually was a wonderful relief for the person, and it was by asphyxiation. They could no longer breathe. And often the body was left hanging up there, or maybe just cut down and left to rot on the ground, scavenged by birds and animals. But the Jewish leadership didn't like dead bodies lying around the place. The evidence for it is incredibly strong. We have endless sources of Christian writings, but there also are Roman sources, because the Romans kept records, and a Roman historian records it, for example. So the death of Jesus by execution in Jerusalem under Pilate and the details are recorded. And there are Jewish sources, because they recorded it as well. Now, the Romans didn't support Jesus and the Jews didn't support Jesus, but it's still recorded. The historical evidence that Jesus was executed under torture in Jerusalem on the authority of the Roman governor Pilate, who's known in history, all of that is overwhelming. And yet, there's a cult of denial. This has come from the Islamic world, because the events of the crucifixion of Jesus undercut the teachings of Islam. So they have invented a story that Jesus didn't die on a cross. Someone took his place. Let's look at the evidence for that. Remember the Roman execution procedures? They carried it out with ruthless efficiency. And the soldiers and their officer, their lives were on the line if they got anything wrong. So any mistakes they made, it was on pain of death, their death. The Romans did not make a mistake. They got the right man. If they'd got the wrong man, they'd have been executed. But his mother was there. And if anyone would know that it was her son being tortured to death, it would be his mother. But how do we explain the behavior of Jesus on the cross? Most people crucified under the agony of pain would be cursing, writhing, suffering terribly. Jesus took it on. And he even expressed forgiveness for those who had strung him up, the Roman executioners. He even had words of comfort for one of his fellow sufferers. And he cried out, "It is finished," which is one word in the original, which is a cry of triumph, the word that was used. How do you explain all of that if it wasn't Jesus? But perhaps the most sweeping and challenging thought is, if we look at all the records of the time, no matter from what source they come, and most of them were unsympathetic to Jesus, there is no whisper of any substitution. Everybody knew that Jesus had been executed by torture on a Roman cross in Jerusalem under Pilate, the Roman governor. You see, the denial of this, which is common Islamic teaching, but it's relatively modern Islamic teaching, it contradicts all the evidence and the total consistency of the historical evidence. And it shows how we can live in a world of make-believe. Truth comes by looking at the evidence. We could summarize it like that. And the evidence is completely overwhelming. Let's look at the text very briefly. And the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium, the building, gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, then twisted a crown of thorns, set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said. They spat on him, took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. After they had mocked him, they took off the robe and put his own clothes on him. And they led him away to crucify him. This would be normal procedure with the Roman soldiers. Stripped naked, bleeding intensively, flesh hanging off his back, humiliated. And he did it willingly. As they were going out, they met a man from Cyrene named Simon, and they forced him to carry the cross. Jesus was so weak he couldn't carry the crossbar. They came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, an execution site. There they offered Jesus wine to drink, mixed with gall. Probably the gall added by his followers, maybe the ladies, to help him. But after tasting it, he refused to drink it. He didn't want his senses deadened. When they crucified him, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. That was the normal procedure. Sitting down, they kept watch over him there. Above his head they placed the written charges against him. "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 rebels, terrorists, were crucified with him, one on his right hand, one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants to. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" In the same way the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. stripped naked in utter humiliation, mocked by the leadership of the people he came to rescue. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing there heard this, they said, he's calling Elijah. It sounds like Elijah. He was speaking in Aramaic. Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it in a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes down to save him. But when Jesus had cried out in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. John records it. He cried out in a loud voice was one word. It is finished. A cry, a word of triumph. The task is done. It's completed. His lips had been moistened enough to allow him to speak. That moment the curtain of the temple was torn from top to bottom. That was the separation between the inner sanctuary. The temple system was gone once and for all. Jesus replaced it. The earth shook, the rocks split, the tombs broke open, the bodies of many holy people who were dead were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection, went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Something momentous happened. When the centurion, those who were guarding Jesus, saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, surely he was the Son of God. Many women were there watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee to care for his needs. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons. The events, and then we'll look at their meaning. Jesus was flogged. A brutal punishment. Stripped naked, tied up, and whipped until the flesh of his back was ripped off the rib cage. He was humiliated before the mourning crowd, the renter mob brought in by the religious leaders. He was cruelly mocked by the soldiers who would not understand what they were doing. They were brutal, and they were used to this. Forced to carry the crossbar, he couldn't manage it. Someone was dragooned in to do it for him. This was typical. The person would carry the instrument of their own execution to the place of execution. Utter humiliation. Pain-deadening drug, perhaps brought by the women to help him. He'd rejected it. Stripped naked, thrown on his back, which would be bleeding intensively. Nailed to the crossbeam raised up, feet nailed onto the upright, and left to die. And on the cross, just ponder for a moment, Jesus, with all the fullness of God resting in him, God entered our humanity in his life. He came to bring hope and freedom for humanity. He did nothing but good for people. And yet here he is, humiliated, tortured, and mocked by the religious leaders of the nation he came to help. How cruel. At least one bandit mocked him. Of course, the bandits would probably be cursing in their agony. John notes that his mother was there. His mother watching the death of her eldest son. Having seen this remarkable son and all that he had done for the benefit of others, the torture for her must have been incredible. Some of his disciples were there. The other gospel accounts do mention it. We know that John was there, for example. And John was left to look after the mother of Jesus. Highly likely that they were related. A group of women had come down. There was quite a crowd had come down with them from the Galilee, his disciples and friends, and a group of women, and they probably did the cooking and washing for that group of men. They saw it, guarded by 5 soldiers throughout. How is it possible that we can deny that Jesus died on a cross? For Jesus himself, that is staggering. He had been brutalized, humiliated, suffering incredible pain, and he forgave those who carried it out. Suffering love always wins. He showed concern for the bandit, the terrorist, who asked for help. He showed concern for his mother. His mother was from the north, in Jerusalem, and he made sure that someone would look after her, and the task was given to John. And he felt the utter separation and desolation. He was on his own. He took it on his own. He didn't fight it. He went through it willingly. But the utter separation, the humiliation, the torture, the pain, the spiritual separation, he felt, if you like, God had left him once and for all. At the moment just before his death, with his lips moistened, "It is finished," that one word of triumph, and he gave his spirit into God's hands. He knew he had done what he was required to do, and through suffering love he'd broken the bondage of rebellion and evil that rested on mankind. In that way he died in triumph, and the word in the original captures it. And there was an immediate impact. Matthew records some of the events. This inexplicable darkness, because of the time of year and knowing it was the Passover weekend, it couldn't have been an eclipse. The inexplicable darkness, it was like evil hovering for the kill. Some have pictured it, and perhaps there's reality in this. Satan and all the hosts of evil were rubbing their hands and saying, "We've got him. We've defeated God. We can take control of this planet completely." Maybe that's true. But evil was hovering for the kill. But in the death of Jesus, that very evil was defeated. And to show it was defeated, the curtain was torn from top to bottom. The temple ritual was finished once and for all. Now no longer needed. Access to God is now open through Jesus, because he has defeated the powers of darkness, so that humanity, individual humans and communities are released, can come into the kingdom and have direct access to God through what Jesus has achieved. Jesus replaces the temple. An earthquake, it is in an earthquake region. And people reported seeing the dead of the past moving around. The symbolism of that is so strong. Death had been defeated. Death was the great threat that hung over humanity. Still does. You can't avoid it. It's going to happen sooner or later. But Jesus was showing that death was not the end. He had defeated it and its power over humans. There is resurrection. We do move on. Our bodies are restored, and in Jesus we move on to a greater and more wonderful life. There is hope. Immediate impact. Now, the Roman officer and his 4 soldiers had seen a lot of this. They'd seen and heard Jesus forgiving others. They'd never, ever, in their experience, ever had to carry an execution where the person under torture did that. They'd heard his cry of anguish as he felt separation from God. They'd heard his loud shout, "It is finished," as his lips were moistened just enough to speak. It is finished. A word of achievement. Achievement? Death by torture? They experienced the grip of the darkness for 3 hours, from roughly midday to 3 o'clock. The earthquake. Probably they'd experienced earthquakes, but they all came together, these events. There was an impact on these soldiers. Much has been made of this, but we've got to be cautious and interpret it in the context of the time. Centurion, those guarding Jesus, that's the 4 soldiers, saw the earthquake and all that happened. They were terrified and exclaimed, "Truly this was this man a son of God." That's literally what it is in the original. Mark records something similar. This man was the Son of God. Luke records that this was a righteous man. Perhaps they said both. There was an impact on these hardened Roman soldiers who were used to carrying out executions, who were completely hardened to it. They had been brutalized by their experiences. Son of God, what did they mean by that? It's a description used of the Roman emperor. That time the Roman emperors were beginning to see themselves as having divinity within them. That was the title that was given. The Romans also used it for very special people, people who in some way reflected the nature of a god. And almost certainly these soldiers would realize something had gone badly wrong here. It was total injustice. This wasn't the normal criminal, the normal terrorist or bandit. This was someone very different. Perhaps Jesus was what he claimed to be. There was an impact, an immediate impact on these hardened Roman soldiers. There's a contrast painted here in the death of Jesus. That's who Jesus was in reality, but he was mocked over these very claims. Son of God, God entered our humanity by choice, limited within a human being. Jesus was fully God with the power of God. He fulfilled the Jewish Messiah picture of the Old Testament, the sent one of God to rescue the people. He replaced the temple. He was the access to God himself. We didn't need a religious ritual system anymore. and he was going to be the one who was going to rescue humanity, or all who would come to him. And yet these very claims were mocked by Roman soldiers when they mocked him before his execution. Mocked by the religious leaders watching, rubbing their hands in glee. We've got rid of the person who's disturbing our cosy system. Mocked by passers-by. Egged on by the religious leaders. There is a contrast implicit in all of this. But the evidence of the reality for who Jesus really is incredibly strong. Look at what he said. Look at how he lived. Look at what he did. Look at how he treated people. Look at the depth of his teaching. And then move forward and look at the history of the world. The Jewish religious system was destroyed. The temple was wiped out and it has never been replaced. The Roman Empire collapsed in chaos. But the followers of Jesus went on and grew in number, till almost 1/3 of the human race today acknowledges Jesus. Some may be lip service, that's true. But the impact of Jesus is enormous on humanity, because he came to rescue us from our rebellion against God. The evidence for the reality of who Jesus claimed to be is simply phenomenal. This is how Paul described it looking back. Jesus being in very nature God. It's worth pondering that. He did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. That captures the meaning well. He lived by choice within the limitations of a human frame. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of his servant, being made in human likeness. The servant king of Isaiah. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death. Death on a cross, the most utter barbaric humiliation and torture you could invent. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place, and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow on heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Find that in Philippians chapter 2. And a great theologian described it this way, and this captures the meaning in a simple statement. The way up is down. The exaltation of Jesus, Jesus being presented to God, having completed the task. The picture of Daniel. It came because the task was completed, which meant that Jesus came down, right down, and defeated the rebellion of the world by dying on a Roman cross. The way up is down. And that again captures a great principle that's encapsulated in the whole meaning of the crucifixion of Jesus. The death of Jesus at a human level but there's a very, very deep spiritual level. Jesus took on the worst that humanity could throw at him, and in suffering love he defeated the power of evil to win and offers liberty to humanity. The evidence? The evidence is absolutely overwhelming. Jesus was crucified. He did die. Roman soldiers did not make a mistake. They did not get the wrong man. There were momentous events that followed. The world was changed. His death made a lasting impact. The Jewish nation was wiped out and scattered. The Roman Empire disintegrated. The way of Jesus went on, and is still going on, despite the attempts of humans throughout the world to persecute the followers of Jesus out of existence. The kingdom is still growing. His impact is felt across all humanity. Injustice enacted, but out of that injustice, suffering love won the greatest victory for humanity, the greatest victory that has ever been won. The story of the crucifixion of Jesus. In the final part, we move on to the burial and resurrection of Jesus, as the story of Jesus is completed and launched into the future.